The wind off Lake Michigan felt like broken glass against my skin. Through the frosted windows of the Winter Garden ballroom, I watched them. My brother Tyler was holding court a crystal champagne flute, catching the light of a chandelier that cost more than my car. My parents Robert and Cynthia were beaming, radiating the kind of warmth that only $500,000 can buy. I looked down at my coat, soaked through with freezing slush. I wasn't on the guest list tonight. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the sudden heat hitting me like a slap. I wasn't here to celebrate. I was here to beg for the one thing they valued less than their public image. My daughter's life. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I found them near the ice sculpture, a 5-foot swan dripping condensation onto a bed of imported orchids. My mother Cynthia was laughing at something a donor said, her head thrown back in a practiced arc that displayed her diamond choker to maximum effect. My father Robert stood with his hand in his pocket, looking like he owned the city. When they saw me, the warmth didn't just fade from their faces. It vanished, replaced by the kind of irritation you feel when a waiter drops a tray during a toast. They didn't ask why I was wet. They didn't ask why I was shaking. They just saw a flaw in their perfect picture. My father steered me into a service alcove away from the photographers. The music was muffled here, replaced by the hum of industrial refrigerators. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told them everything. Lily's condition had deteriorated. The insurance gap was real. The neurosurgery had to happen this week or the damage would be permanent. I needed the loan they had promised me 6 months ago, $185,000. It was a lot of money to most people, but to Robert and Cynthia it was a rounding error. It was less than the catering budget for tonight. My father checked his watch. He actually checked his watch while I was describing his granddaughter's potential brain damage. My mother reached out not to comfort me but to tuck a wet strand of hair behind my ear. She told me to keep my voice down. Then they dropped the hammer. They couldn't give me the money. Not because they didn't have it, but because it was tied up. They explained it with a sickening calmness. The funds were currently allocated to image rights. They had secured an exclusive feature in a high-end lifestyle magazine for Tyler's wedding, and the contract required a certain level of visible opulence. They had to pay for venue exclusivity for influencers to attend, for the right kind of lighting to ensure the photos went viral. If they pulled out $185,000 now, it would trigger a liquidity clause. It would make them look financially unstable to their peers. I stared at them, and for the first time I truly understood the architecture of their souls. This is what I call the narcissist's ledger. To my parents, money wasn't a tool for survival. It was a costume. They didn't possess wealth. The wealth possessed them. They were addicts, and their drug of choice was the envy of strangers. In their minds, saving Lily was a private act with zero return on investment. It wouldn't get likes. It wouldn't get them on the cover of a magazine. But throwing $500,000 at a wedding, that bought them the illusion of power. They were willing to sacrifice a human life to maintain the glossy veneer of their existence. They couldn't liquidate the money because to them money that couldn't be seen didn't exist. They were empty vaults painted gold. My father adjusted his cufflinks and told me to be reasonable. He said they had a reputation to uphold. I saw a man who would let a child die rather than admit he couldn't afford a centerpiece. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't talking to family. I was negotiating with a corporation that had decided my daughter was a bad asset, and the negotiation was over. Security escorted me out. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream. I just looked back once and saw my brother Tyler watching from the balcony, a flute of champagne in his hand. He gave a subtle nod to the guard, a silent command to remove the stain from his perfect evening. I walked out into the blizzard, the wind tearing at my clothes, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the freeze that had just settled in my chest. I pulled out my phone. My hands were numb, but my mind was surgical. I didn't call them to beg. I didn't send a text full of rage. I simply opened my contacts list. I found the entry for Mom and deleted it. Then Dad. Then Tyler. I didn't block them. That would imply I cared enough to be bothered. I just erased their names. They were no longer family. They were just people I used to know who had defaulted on a moral debt. When I got back to our apartment, the silence was heavy. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by a fortress of denial letters. Banks didn't care about sick children. They cared about risk, and we were high risk. I shook my head as I walked in, and the hope in his eyes died a quiet death. We sat there in the dim light, two people watching their world crumble, calculating how much we could get for our wedding rings, for the furniture, for our blood. Then there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a delivery. It was Gregory and Patricia, Ethan's parents. They stood in the hallway, shaking the snow off their worn coats. They looked nothing like the polished socialites I had just left. Gregory's hands were calloused and permanently stained with soil. Patricia wore a coat she had mended 3 times. They didn't come in with apologies or empty comforts. They came in with an envelope. Gregory placed it on the table. It was heavy, thick with legal stamps. I opened it, and the room spun. It was the deed to their apple orchard. The land that had been in their family for 3 generations. The land where Ethan learned to walk, where Gregory had taught me to graft branches where they planned to be buried. Attached to the deed was a bill of sale. They had sold it to a developer that morning. The check was made out for exactly $185,000. I tried to push it back. I told them we couldn't take their history. I told them this was their legacy. Patricia took my hands in hers. Her skin was rough like bark, but her grip was iron. She told me that land is just dirt, but Lily is the seed. She said they could live in an apartment, but they couldn't live in a world without their granddaughter. In that moment, the logic of the chosen family crystallized in my mind. For 32 years, I had believed that blood was a binding contract, a mystical tie that obligated me to endure abuse. But as I looked at Gregory and Patricia, I realized that biology is just a biological accident. Family is a deliberate, repeated choice. My parents shared my DNA, but they were strangers who would let my daughter die to preserve a magazine layout. These people who shared no blood with me had just severed their own roots to ensure mine could grow. I stopped grieving the family I was born into, and started honoring the family that chose me. I accepted the check. I didn't just take their money. I took their love, and I swore on everything I had left that I would build a monument to this sacrifice. I wasn't just going to save Lily. I was going to make sure Gregory and Patricia never regretted this for a single second. 3 years is a long time to hold your breath, but it's the perfect amount of time to build an empire. Lily was 9 now, her scar a faint white line on her neck, her laughter loud enough to fill the small apartment we still lived in. I hadn't spent a single dollar on luxury. Every cent I earned, every bonus, every freelance check went into 2 places: repaying Gregory and Patricia and building my portfolio. I wasn't just working, I was weaponizing my grief. I had turned the memory of that lost orchard into a design philosophy. The boardroom of the City Planning Commission was a glass cage suspended 40 stories above the Chicago skyline. I was there to pitch for the Urban Green Belt, a $5 million contract to redesign the city's Riverwalk and public parks. My competitors were legacy firms, men in bespoke suits who designed parks like they were designing parking lots, efficient, sterile concrete. They talked about foot traffic metrics and maintenance costs. I sat in silence, my hand resting on a leather portfolio that contained not just blueprints but a resurrection. When it was my turn, I didn't start with numbers. I didn't start with maintenance cycles. I placed a single photograph on the polished mahogany table. It was a picture of Gregory and Patricia standing in their orchard, days before it was bulldozed. The trees were gnarled heavy with fruit, chaotic and beautiful. "We treat cities like machines," I told the board, my voice steady. "We build for efficiency. But people don't fall in love with machines, they fall in love with history." I unveiled my renderings. My design wasn't neat rows of saplings, it was wild. It incorporated heritage apple trees, native prairie grasses, and stone pathways that mimicked the flow of the river before the concrete tamed it. I told them about the orchard. I didn't use names, but I told them about a piece of land that was sold to save a life. I explained that when we lose our connection to the soil, we lose our obligation to each other. My proposal was to bring that obligation back, to build a space where the city remembered what it used to be. The room went quiet. The chairman, a man known for cutting budgets with a red pen, took off his glasses. He looked at the photo of the orchard, then at my renderings. He didn't ask about the cost of the limestone. He asked if the trees would survive the winter. "They have deep roots," I said. "They were bred to survive the freeze." I walked out of that meeting with the contract signed. $5 million. It wasn't just a job. It was a coronation. I called Ethan from the lobby. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just said, "We got it." He exhaled a sound like a weight dropping from his shoulders. With this contract, I wasn't just a landscape architect anymore. I was a power player in the city's infrastructure. I had the capital, the reputation, and the connections to do what I had promised myself 3 years ago. I could finally balance the ledger. With the resources from the Greenbelt contract, I did what any successful architect would do. I reinforced my foundations. But I also did what any vengeful daughter would do. I investigated the cracks in my family's facade. I hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Sarah, who specialized in high net worth divorces and corporate malfeasance. I handed her the loan agreement I had signed with my parents years ago, a piece of paper they had ignored when I needed them most. I told her I wanted to sue for breach of contract. I wanted the money they promised. Sarah took the paperwork, but she came back a week later with something far more lethal than a lawsuit. She had found the ledger of lies. We met in my new office, a space filled with light and living plants. Sarah laid out a spreadsheet that looked like a crime scene map. She had audited my father's old company records as part of the discovery process. She pointed to a series of withdrawals made 3 years ago, right around the time of Tyler's wedding. They weren't listed as PR expenses or marketing. They were listed under shell vendors that didn't exist. There was no Vogue feature, Sarah said, her voice flat. I checked the archives. Tyler's wedding was never published anywhere except his own Instagram. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then where did the money go? Sarah slid a second document across the desk. It was a police report from Las Vegas dated 2 months before the wedding. Tyler had been detained for writing bad checks at a casino. The charges were dropped, likely because someone paid a massive settlement. Your brother embezzled nearly $200,000 from your father's firm to cover gambling debts, Sarah explained. Your father didn't use the money for image rights. He used it to plug the hole in the company accounts before the auditors came. He covered up a felony. I sat back the air, leaving my lungs. The cruelty of that night in the blizzard suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. They hadn't refused me because they were vain. They had refused me because they were already broke. They had sacrificed my daughter's life not for a magazine spread, but to save their golden child from prison. Tyler wasn't just a spoiled brat. He was a thief, and my parents weren't just narcissists, they were accomplices. I looked at the documents. This was leverage. This was nuclear. I could go to the police. I could send Tyler to jail and ruin my parents' reputation forever. But as I stared at the numbers, I realized that prison was too clean. It was too public. It would make them martyrs. I didn't want them to be victims. I wanted them to be erased. I thanked Sarah and told her to prepare a different kind of file. I wasn't going to sue them. I was going to buy them. The collapse of the House of Winters didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a quiet administrative whimper. 2 weeks after I met with Sarah, the bank called Robert's loan. The irregularities in his company accounts, the ones used to hide Tyler's theft, had triggered a compliance audit. When the auditors pulled the thread, the whole tapestry unraveled. They weren't just broke, they were facing federal charges for fraud if they couldn't balance the books within 48 hours. That's when my phone rang. It was my mother. She didn't demand this time. She didn't scold. She wept. I agreed to meet them. I didn't go as a daughter returning home. I went as a creditor inspecting a distressed asset. I wore my best tailored suit, the one I wore to close the Greenbelt deal. I took a car service to their building, the Lakeshore Drive high-rise that had always been their fortress of solitude. The doorman who used to look through me rushed to open the door. He knew who I was now. Everyone in the city did. The penthouse was a mausoleum of white marble and glass, but the air inside was stale. The curated art collection was gone, leaving pale rectangles on the walls like ghosts. Cardboard boxes were stacked in the foyer, blocking the view of the lake. My parents sat on a white leather sofa that was already tagged for auction. Robert looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him. His silver beard was unkempt, his hands shaking as he held a tumbler of scotch. Cynthia sat beside him, staring at her hands, stripped of her jewelry. And in the corner, sitting on a packing crate, was Tyler. The golden child looked tarnished. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Robert tried to stand to summon some of his old authority, but he just looked tired. He started talking about a misunderstanding with the bank. He used words like liquidity crunch and short-term bridge. He told me that if I could just lend them $350,000, they could settle the audit, sell the apartment quietly, and move to Florida. He appealed to my sense of duty. He said, "We're family, Savannah. We made mistakes, but we're family." I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city I was helping to rebuild. Then I turned back to them. "I know," I said softly. "I know about the audit. I know about the shell companies." I looked directly at Tyler. He flinched. "And I know about Las Vegas." The room seemed to lose all its oxygen. Cynthia let out a small gasp. Robert froze his glass halfway to his mouth. "I know you didn't spend my daughter's surgery money on a magazine spread," I continued, my voice clinical. "You spent it to keep your son out of prison. You sacrificed Lily to cover up a felony." I reached into my bag and pulled out the file Sarah had prepared. I dropped it on the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud, louder than any shout. I have the police reports. I have the bank transfers. I have everything. Robert sank back onto the sofa, defeated. The pretense was gone. There was no more posturing, no more lies about image rights. There was just the cold, hard truth that I held their lives in my hands. They weren't asking for a loan anymore. They were begging for mercy. And for the first time in 35 years, I was the one deciding the price. I stood there looking down at the people who had created me, and I felt nothing but a calm professional detachment. They were waiting for me to scream, to lecture, to demand an apology. But I didn't want their apologies. I wanted finality. I reached into my bag again and pulled out a checkbook. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the penthouse. I wrote the check for exactly $350,000, the amount needed to cover the immediate debt and keep the federal prosecutors at bay. I tore it out and placed it next to the evidence file. "Here is your bailout," I said. "It covers the audit debt. It keeps Tyler out of jail. It saves your reputation, or what's left of it." Robert reached for it, his hand trembling with relief, but I pressed my finger down on the check, pinning it to the glass. "But this isn't a gift. And it isn't a loan. It's a severance package." I pulled out a contract my lawyer had drafted that morning. It was brutal in its simplicity. In exchange for the funds, Robert, Cynthia, and Tyler agreed to relinquish all legal and social claims to me and my daughter. They would never contact us again. They would never mention us in interviews. We would become strangers by law. "This is the golden severance," I told them. "I am buying my freedom. You sign this, you take the money, and you disappear from my life. Forever." Cynthia started to cry, whispering about how I couldn't do this, how blood is thicker than water. I looked at her, then at Tyler, then at the check. "You sold my daughter for an image," I said. "Now I'm buying my peace. Sign it or I walk out, and the auditors walk in." They signed. They wept, but they signed, because in the end, they loved their freedom more than they loved me. I took the contract, left the check, and walked out of the penthouse without looking back. A week later, I stood in the middle of a reclaimed industrial lot in the South Side. It was opening day for the Gregory and Patricia Orchard Park. The air was crisp, smelling of turning leaves and fresh earth. The park was beautiful, wild, chaotic, and full of life, exactly as I had designed it. Gregory and Patricia stood beside me, cutting the ribbon. They were crying, but these were good tears. Behind us, a bronze plaque was mounted on a rough-hewn stone. It read, "For those who planted seeds they would never see grow, the harvest is yours." I watched Lily run through the tall grass chasing butterflies, her laughter ringing out against the city skyline. Ethan put his arm around me, and I leaned into him. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I knew it wasn't my parents. They were gone, paid off, and erased like a bad debt. I was lighter than I had ever been. I had lost my history, yes, but I had saved my future. And standing there in the garden I built from the ashes of my grief, I realized that was a price I would pay 1,000 times over. If you've ever had to choose your peace over your history, share this story. You are not alone.